I once knelt in the rain pregnant, begging my mother to open the door. She looked at me, not a single tear, and said just 5 words. You made your choice. 3 years later, I became a lawyer. And guess what? They, the ones who disowned me and my biracial son, called begging me to save my brother who got arrested. I said yes, but only on one condition. They publicly apologize for abandoning a child because of his skin color. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Hit that subscribe button and follow our emotional storytelling films about justice and redemption. The rain was cold, Montgomery, Alabama cold, which meant it didn't freeze your skin but seeped into your bones, slow and miserable like judgment that never left. Amelia Carter stood on the porch. She once learned to walk on soaked through arms wrapped tightly around her swollen belly, as if shielding the life inside from the storm that raged outside, and worse, the one waiting behind the door. She didn't knock right away. The porch light was off, no warm glow, no sign that anyone was waiting. But she knew they were in there. She could see the flicker of the television through the living room curtains, could hear the faint hum of her mother's nightly news. Her knuckles hesitated in the air. What if she turned around? But then a kick. Small, insistent, a reminder. She knocked. Footsteps, familiar, measured, her mother's. The door opened just wide enough for a silhouette to appear. Deborah Carter didn't gasp, didn't reach. Her eyes, sharp and exacting, scanned down Amelia's rain-plastered hair, the maternity dress clinging to her skin, and stopped at the curve of her stomach. Nothing softened. No motherly instinct kicked in. Amelia, she said flatly. Then her eyes narrowed. You're still pregnant. Still, as if it were an inconvenience left unresolved. Amelia's voice trembled as she tried to speak over the thunder cracking behind her. I didn't know where else to go, Mama. I just need somewhere for tonight, please. Deborah leaned her head slightly to the side, examining her daughter like a stain on a carpet. Where's your husband? Amelia paused. A pause too long. I didn't think so, Deborah answered herself. You made your choice. She stepped forward just enough for the light from the hallway to reveal her face unmoved, icy, not a trace of maternal warmth. Then came the words. 5 of them, precise as a slap. 對照後quả đi. Not, I'm disappointed. Not, why didn't you tell us sooner? Just a verdict, no trial. Amelia's bottom lip trembled. It's your grandchild, Mama. Please, don't. Deborah's voice sliced through her plea. You know how your father feels. You know what you did. That man, he was never welcome. You got into this mess, Amelia. You get out of it. She started to close the door. Wait! Amelia reached out, but the door caught her wrist instead. It thudded shut in her face, severing the last fragile thread that connected her to this house. She stood there in the rain, staring at the door as if it might open again. But it didn't. She walked away slowly, down the steps. Past the garden she helped plant at 11. Past the mailbox she decorated with stickers at 7. Past the place where love used to live. The motel room door creaked open with a push that took more effort than it should have. Amelia's arms were numb from the cold, her clothes heavy with water. The smell of mildew slapped her in the face, cheap carpet, old AC unit, and dampness that hadn't left the walls since 1998. She dropped her overnight bag, really just a duffel with 2 changes of clothes and a folded-up sonogram photo, and locked the door behind her with trembling hands. There was no heater, no warmth, just a rust-colored bedspread and a flickering ceiling light. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle. It was so quiet it hurt. Her hands instinctively went to her belly. The baby kicked again. She exhaled a sharp breath, half sob, half relief. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry I brought you into this like this. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with rainwater. She didn't bother to wipe them away. She reached for her phone. 1 bar of service. No missed calls. Not from her father. Not from her younger brother, Jordan. Definitely not from her mother. She typed a message anyway. Just 1 word, please. And hit send. Then waited. And waited. No reply. She stood slowly and walked into the tiny motel bathroom. A buzzing fluorescent bulb overhead cast a sickly glow over the cracked sink and warped mirror. She stared at her reflection. She didn't recognize herself. Her hair was plastered to her scalp. Her lips were pale. Her eyes haunted. Her phone buzzed once. Her heart leapt. She ran out, picked it up. Message from Mom, you've made your bed. That was it. She deleted the message. And then something inside her, something old but resilient, hardened. She pulled out the folded sonogram from her bag, taped it to the motel wall beside the bed with a piece of gum wrapper. A small act of defiance. A marker of intention. You're not a mistake, she whispered. They don't get to say that. She climbed into the bed, pulling the thin motel blanket over her damp body, trying not to think about tomorrow. About hospitals, about giving birth alone. But even in the ache, even in the rejection, a small ember began to glow. She was going to survive this. For him. For the child they'd already discarded without meeting. She pressed her palm against her stomach and whispered, "I'm your home now." And with that, Amelia Carter closed her eyes, rain still falling outside, and let the silence cradle her better than any mother ever had. 3 years later, the girl who had once stood in the rain begging her mother for mercy now stood behind the counter at a worn-out diner in Westwood, apron stained with coffee, and a name tag that read Mia, not Amelia. Mia was easier for customers to say, easier to swallow for people who looked her up and down when she handed them menus with a polite smile. The morning rush had thinned, leaving behind the clink of dishes and the low hum of a local radio station playing a country ballad that sounded too hopeful for how her feet felt. She rubbed the back of her neck, glancing at the time, 11:42 a.m. She had precisely 2 hours before her second shift, her real shift, began. Not at the diner, but in front of a laptop in the corner of her apartment, headphones on baby monitor nearby, logged into an online law class that always started with someone asking a question they'd clearly Googled 30 seconds earlier. She filled 2 more coffee mugs for the old men playing dominoes in the corner booth, then clocked out, untied her apron, and left through the back entrance. Her beat-up sedan groaned to life, the only witness to how exhausted she really was. Her apartment was in the kind of building people didn't look at twice. Beige siding, cracked steps, and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. But to Amelia, it was a fortress. Home wasn't about architecture. It was about who waited for you behind the door. "Hi, baby," she whispered as she stepped inside. Malik turned from where he sat in his high chair, his face lighting up at the sound of her voice. He was eating a slice of banana with both hands, cheeks puffed out like a chipmunk. "Messy boy," she grinned, dropping her keys and kissing his forehead. His skin was the warm brown of his father's hair, a cascade of tight curls that refused to be tamed, and his eyes were everything Amelia had survived for. Rich and soulful, sometimes too old for a 2-year-old, like they knew something. She cleaned his hands and carried him to the worn love seat in the living room. The apartment was cramped but clean. Books stacked under the table legs to keep it level. Crayon drawings taped on the fridge. One framed photo, only one. It was of Malik's father, Christopher Deshaun Morris. God, even his name sounded like music. He'd been a jazz trumpeter, street performer turned studio session regular with the kind of soul that turned heads in a crowd and the kind of laugh that made you forget you were sad. She'd met him at an open mic night while running sound for a community event during college. He'd flirted with her by playing Georgia on My Mind without ever saying a word. They fell hard, reckless, and fearless, moved in together within 6 months, married in 10. But not before the fights with her parents. "He's not like us," her mother had said. "You mean he's not white?" Amelia had replied coldly. "He's not stable," her father insisted. "Music isn't a career, it's a hobby." "You didn't care when my old boyfriend dropped out to start a crypto app," she'd fired back. That was the last real conversation they had before she left the family house for good. She and Chris built their life from scratch. It wasn't glamorous. Ramen nights and couch rehearsals, shared dreams on Post-it notes stuck to the bathroom mirror. They didn't have much, but they had music. And love. Until the night he didn't come home. A drunk driver, no warning, no goodbye. Amelia found herself sitting on the floor of the emergency room with her wedding ring clenched so hard in her palm, it left an imprint that wouldn't fade for weeks. She was 8 weeks pregnant. Everyone assumed she'd abort. The whispering coworkers, the nosy landlord, even her professor at the time who left pamphlets on her desk without asking. But Malik was never a decision. He was a declaration. Now 3 years later, Amelia lit a candle on the windowsill every night in Chris's memory. She didn't talk to him, she wasn't spiritual like that, but she burned that candle because it made her feel less alone. Because it reminded her that love didn't die just because people did. Malik babbled beside her, playing with the worn pages of a book he pretended to read. She smiled and opened her laptop, waiting for her law professor's face to pop up on the screen. It wasn't glamorous studying tort reform while scraping syrup off diner tables, but she was doing it every day. Every exam passed, every case brief written at midnight while Malik slept was a small rebellion against the life people thought she deserved. She kept a journal, nothing fancy, just a spiral notebook where she scrawled her thoughts before sleep claimed her. In the back was a list titled Promises to Malik, And underneath that list tonight, she added one more line. One day you'll look at me and be proud that I never gave up on us. She closed the book, leaned her head back against the wall, and whispered, I got you, baby. I got us both. And even in the stillness of that tiny apartment, she felt something powerful move inside her. Not rage, not regret, but fire, the kind that built cities or burned down old ones. The storm started early that night, a low growl rolling in from the west, shaking the windows of Amelia's apartment like a warning. Rain lashed against the glass with increasing fury, drumming a rhythm she'd grown used to, one that usually meant another sleepless night. She was curled on the couch, Malik asleep in his room, his nightlight glowing softly behind the cracked door. A textbook lay open on her lap, unread. Her eyes were locked on the window, lost in the patterns the water traced down the pane. Then her phone rang. At first she didn't move. No one called her this late, not unless something was wrong. She glanced down at the screen. Dad! For a moment her entire body froze. She hadn't seen that name light up her phone in years, not since the night she stood in the rain on their porch and her mother slammed the door in her face. Her father hadn't called then. He hadn't called when Chris died. He hadn't even called when Malik was born. 3 years of silence wrapped around that name like a noose. The phone rang again. She picked it up, not because she wanted to, but because something deeper than anger, something buried beneath grief and spite, forced her thumb to slide across the screen. She didn't speak first. Amelia. The voice was older, tired, rougher than she remembered. She let the silence hang punishing. It's your dad, he added pointlessly. I know, she said, her voice flat. You're not easy to forget. A beat passed, then another. Finally, he said, it's about Jordan. Her heart pinched. What about him? He was arrested tonight. Amelia sat up straighter. What? Assault, her father mumbled. Something happened downtown. He hit a man. They say it was unprovoked. She closed her eyes. Jordan. Her little brother. The only one who hadn't openly turned his back on her, even if he'd never fought for her either. When she was pregnant and alone, he'd texted her once. You okay? But when she replied, no, he never answered again. Still, it was Jordan. Is he in jail? Yes, her father answered. Holding until bail is posted. There'll be a hearing tomorrow morning. Then you should get a lawyer, she said, voice clipped. Another silence. That's why I'm calling, he finally said. Your mother and we don't have the money for an attorney right now. The good ones they charge up front and public defenders. You know how that goes. Amelia felt something ice cold settle over her spine. She had imagined this moment before, not in detail but vaguely. The idea of them needing her someday. She just never imagined how sharply it would cut. You need me to represent him, she asked slowly. He didn't answer right away. That was his mistake. Wow, she whispered almost to herself. Not a word for 3 years. Not when I begged you to help. Not when I gave birth alone. Not even to meet your grandson. But now suddenly, I'm a number in your contacts again. We're not proud of how things went, he muttered. No, she said, a bitter laugh escaping. You were proud, all right. Proud enough to call my baby a stain. You let her do it. You let her say it. We made mistakes. You didn't make mistakes, she snapped. You made choices. You chose silence. You chose to stand behind a woman who treated your daughter like trash because she loved someone who didn't look like you. Amelia? No, you don't get to say my name like we're fine, like we're anything. A thunderclap cracked in the distance. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Amelia stood and walked toward the window, her reflection barely visible in the dark. What exactly do you want from me? She asked. You want me to just show up in court and pretend we're still a family. I want you to help your brother. Why? Because he's your blood. Her stomach twisted. That word blood had been used like a weapon for years, as a justification, as an excuse, as a leash. You only remember blood when you're bleeding, she said. Her father didn't respond. Do you even know your grandson's name? A pause. Then almost sheepishly, no. His name is Malik, she said quietly. He has his father's eyes. He laughs like him too. You would have liked Chris, you know. But you never gave him the chance. Because your pride was louder than your love. I'm sorry. She let those 2 words hang in the air. Not because she believed them, but because they were new. And in all the years of silent dinners and cold shoulders and racist undertones, she'd never once heard them spoken aloud. She breathed in. I'll represent Jordan, she said, voice cool. But I have a condition. Anything. I want you and Mom to apologize. I just did. No, she cut in sharply. Not to me, not in private. I want you to say it out loud. In court. On the record. I want the judge, the lawyers, the people sitting in the back row to hear you say, we wronged our daughter because we couldn't accept her love and her child because of the color of his skin. The silence that followed was absolute. That's a lot to ask, he said eventually. No, Amelia replied. A lot to ask was what I did 3 years ago. Begging for a roof while carrying a child. This is basic decency. You're asking us to humiliate ourselves? No, she said, her voice sharper now. I'm giving you a chance to unhumiliate me, to reclaim an ounce of what you buried with your silence. If you want my help, it comes with truth. All of it, publicly. She could hear the tension in his breath, could hear her mother's voice faintly in the background asking who he was talking to. Then the muffled words, it's her. She's making demands. Tell her she's damn right, Amelia said aloud. I need to think about it, her father finally said. You don't have time, Amelia replied, walking toward her son's door, placing a hand on the frame. Court's in the morning. Decide who you want standing beside your son, your silence, or your daughter. She hung up. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside she stood still, solid, unshaken. The house hadn't changed. That was the first thing Amelia noticed as she stood at the end of the walkway, clutching Malik's small hand in hers. The siding still bore the same pale yellow paint, sun-faded and chipped. The porch light flickered like always, as if unsure whether it wanted to stay on. Even the wind chimes, those damned chimes she'd hated as a teenager, still dangled in the same crooked spot, catching the light rain with soft metallic sighs. But something had shifted inside her. Not the house. Her. Malik tugged at her hand gently. Is this where Grandma lives? Amelia glanced down. His hoodie was damp from the walk from the car. She adjusted the hood, then nodded. It used to be my house too, she whispered. And maybe that was the hardest part, realizing how once familiar places could become strange, hostile terrain. She raised a hand and knocked, not with hesitation, but with the kind of practiced resolve she'd cultivated like armor. The door opened. Her father stood there, older than she remembered, his hair thinner, his shoulders stooped. The years had not been kind, though she wasn't sure if it was time that had worn him down or guilt. Come in, he said, stepping aside. She guided Malik through the threshold. Immediately, she was hit with a wave of lemon cleaner and tension. That smell, the one her mother obsessed over, still clung to every surface, masking everything else. The hallway stretched in front of her like a memory she didn't want to unpack. She kept her chin high as she entered the living room. Her mother sat on the floral-patterned sofa like a queen in a kingdom of denial, a notebook open on her lap. At the far end, her Aunt Clara whispered something to her cousin Greg. Jordan wasn't there yet. And no one looked up. No one except the family dog, Bailey, old limping tail, thudding softly against the carpet when he recognized her. He tried to rise but failed, settling for a low whine of recognition. Even that felt more welcoming than the humans in the room. Amelia took a slow breath and moved to the center of the space. I'm here, she said simply. Her mother's eyes finally flicked up cool and sharp. Then they moved past Amelia, landing on Malik. They stopped, locked, assessed. Malik, holding tight to his mother's coat, blinked up at his grandmother with open curiosity. He smiled because he didn't know better. Her mother didn't smile back. No hello, no acknowledgement, just silence. Amelia's jaw tensed. Malik, she said gently, this is Grandma. The child gave a shy wave. Hi. Her mother offered a tight nod and immediately looked back at her notes. The dismissal was surgical. Let's sit, her father said, trying to bridge the moment. He gestured to the armchair. Amelia took the love seat instead, pulling Malik onto her lap. His tiny legs dangled, kicking gently. He was watching everyone reading the room in the way only children can. Something in his posture tightened. No one offered him a toy, a juice box, a question. Aunt Clara finally cleared her throat. We were just discussing the hearing tomorrow, she said to Amelia, ignoring the toddler on her lap like he was invisible. We think a character defense might help. Amelia raised an eyebrow. From who? Well, you, Clara said. I thought I was just the lawyer, Amelia replied. Now you want me to vouch for his character too? It would help, her father mumbled. The optics are bad. People are already talking. Amelia narrowed her eyes. People are always talking. They were talking when I married Chris, talking when I had Malik. You cared then. Now suddenly it's inconvenient. Her mother sighed audibly, snapping her notebook shut. This doesn't have to turn into a lecture, Amelia. No, she said, her voice sharp but calm. It already is. You just don't like who's giving it. Malik shifted in her lap. Mommy, he whispered. Can we go home? Amelia kissed the top of his curls. Soon, baby. Her father walked over with 2 mugs of tea, only one for her. None for Malik. You should make him one too, she said pointedly. We don't have juice, he stammered. He drinks tea, she lied. Chamomile, like his father did. Her father blinked. Right. And then the line that undid her a little more than she expected. Your mother still hasn't adjusted, he said low. Amelia turned her head slowly, eyes cutting toward the woman who still sat across the room like an untouched statue, adjusted. He nodded. It's not easy, you know how she is. Oh, I know exactly how she is. She stood up holding Malik against her hip. The boy clung to her neck, sensing now clearly that something was wrong in this house. That love did not live here, not for them. I didn't come here to be tolerated, Amelia said. You came to help your brother, her mother shot back. No, she said. I came for justice. I'll represent him. I'll do my job. But after that I walk. Silence fell again. Then her mother muttered something. What was that? Amelia asked, tilting her head. I said, you act like a victim. But you made your bed, Amelia. You married into a world we didn't choose. And you think that excuses this? She gestured around the room. This silence. This boy, your grandson being treated like he doesn't exist. Malik's lip trembled. Amelia pulled him close. I don't need your love anymore, she said softly. But he never deserved your hate. With that, she turned and walked down the hall toward her childhood bedroom. But when she opened the door, she found it stripped bare. New carpet, fresh paint. It was now a guest room. Neutral, bland. The walls held no echo of her. No trophies, no photos, no trace that she had ever existed in this house. She closed the door and leaned against it, holding Malik to her chest. He was quiet now, head resting on her shoulder. I'm sorry, she whispered to him. But Malik, with the unknowing grace of a child, simply whispered back, I love you, Mama. And for the first time that night, something in her unclenched. They would get through this, not because the house welcomed them, but because they didn't need it to. The footage was everywhere. Grainy, shaky, recorded on a cell phone with someone's voice off camera whispering, oh my God, right before the punch landed. It was a single hit, but it was enough. A tall young man, Jordan Carter, screaming something unintelligible, face contorted in rage, slamming his fist into the face of a hunched figure in a tattered jacket near the bus station bench. The older man crumpled, blood blooming across his face like a flower, while the phone camera lingered just long enough to catch Jordan backing away, breath-heaving, eyes wild. The video had gone viral before Jordan's booking photo was uploaded. By the time Amelia pulled into the courthouse parking lot that morning, the story had already been framed. Young man from respected family assaults, harmless homeless veteran in public meltdown. Her brother had become a cautionary headline. She sat in her car, a moment longer engine off Malik's toy dinosaur, still wedged between the seats from last week's grocery run. She stared at the courthouse steps. Her reflection in the windshield looked unfamiliar, hard eyes, drawn mouth. She looked like someone preparing for war. Inside the courthouse, Jordan sat handcuffed at a table, head bowed, face blank. He didn't even look up when she entered. Amelia approached slowly, her heels echoing too loudly in the sterile room. Jordan, she said carefully. He glanced up. His face was bruised from the scuffle and his left eye was still swollen, but the pain in his eyes wasn't physical. You shouldn't have come, he muttered. I'm your lawyer now, she said simply. He shook his head. This is bad, Mia. I've seen the video, she replied. Everyone has. He swallowed. It's not what it looks like. Then tell me what it is. Jordan hesitated. His eyes shifted to the two officers standing nearby. Amelia leaned closer, lowering her voice. Who was that man? Jordan closed his eyes. His name's Emery. He used to know me. He used to help me. Years ago. Help you how? I was not okay after high school. After you left, after everything with the family, I didn't want to talk to anyone. Emery used to sit outside my job. He talked to me. Bought me coffee when I didn't ask. Told me stories. He was a vet. Navy, I think. Had some issues. PTSD, maybe. But he was good. Amelia frowned. So why did you hit him? Jordan's jaw tightened. Because he wasn't good anymore. Something changed. He looked down at his hands. The last few weeks he's been different. Mean. He says these things now. Crazy things. He cornered me near the station 2 nights ago, said I owed him, that I left him behind. I thought maybe he was drunk or just confused. But then, yesterday... He paused. Breath shaky. He had a knife, Mia. He flashed it. Said I had taken everything from him. I panicked. Amelia went still. A knife. I don't know if he meant to hurt me, Jordan said quickly. But yeah, it was there. He put it away before anyone saw. But I swear I wouldn't have touched him if I wasn't scared. She leaned back, her mind already spinning. There was no mention of a weapon in the video. Why didn't you tell the police? Because they didn't ask. They just cuffed me. The video was enough for them. She looked at him hard. Is that the truth? I swear. She nodded slowly. Okay, let's prove it. That afternoon, Amelia walked the block where the altercation happened. The bus station was mostly empty now, save for a few smokers clustered near the shelter and a man pushing a cart loaded with blankets and empty cans. She pulled out her phone and rewatched the video. The angle was bad. You couldn't see the man's hands. You couldn't see what happened just before the punch, just the blow and the collapse. Out of context, Jordan looked like a monster. But she knew him better than that. Knew the boy who used to sneak her peanut butter crackers during her college study nights. Knew the teenager who cried silently when she packed up her things and left home for the last time. There was more to this. She scanned the block. A small corner store sat across the street. An ancient security camera blinked above the door. She walked in. The cashier was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a pink scarf. She looked up suspicious but curious. Hi, Amelia began pulling out a photo of Jordan. Do you remember this guy? The woman squinted. That the boy who punched the vet? Amelia braced herself. Yes, but I think there's more to the story. Do you have security footage from that day? The woman hesitated. I don't usually show that to people. I'm his lawyer, Amelia said, voice steady. And if what I think happened actually happened, it could change everything. The woman tapped her nails on the counter. Then with a sigh, she motioned toward the back. Come on, let's take a look. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. From across the street, it showed a partial view of the sidewalk in front of the bus bench. Amelia leaned in. There was Jordan approaching from the right earbuds and head down. Then the older man, Emery, presumably stepped directly into his path. They exchanged words. Emery reached into his coat. For a moment, Amelia's breath caught. A flash of metal, quick, shiny. Not long, not exaggerated. But it was there. A blade. Jordan froze, stepped back, then lunged forward. The moment replayed in her mind over and over. This wasn't rage, it wasn't malice. It was instinct. Fear. Panic. Amelia sat back in the chair, heart pounding. I need a copy of this, she said. The woman nodded. Already emailed it to myself. I can send it to you. Amelia stood. Thank you. You may have just saved my brother. The woman nodded again, her eyes softening. I hope he's okay. And I hope that vet gets help too. Poor man's been on the street so long, I think the war never ended for him. Back in her car, Amelia sat in silence. Something still bothered her. Why had Emery turned? What had happened between those moments of kindness years ago and the violence now? She opened her laptop and started digging. News archives, veteran support forums, local mental health alerts, and there barely a paragraph in a community bulletin, Emery Watkins 56 missing from transitional housing. Off medication. Considered nonviolent but unstable. She read it twice. Emery hadn't been himself. He was a casualty of the system that forgot him. Just like her brother had almost become a casualty of a system that judged too quickly. And now two men, both failed by the same society, had collided on a sidewalk. Only one was in handcuffs. But maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. The sound of metal scraping against concrete echoed off the cinder block walls, steady and slow as a correctional officer guided Amelia through the narrow corridor. Her heels clicked sharply with each step, but her pace never faltered. The air inside the county jail was stale and over-chlorinated, like someone had tried too hard to scrub away the rot. She carried a manila folder tucked beneath her arm. Inside was the flash drive from the corner store. A copy of the footage. Proof. Leverage. But she wasn't here just for strategy. This visit was personal, whether she liked it or not. The officer stopped in front of a steel door with a small fogged window. He's in there. You've got 20 minutes. Amelia nodded once. Thanks. He opened the door. She stepped inside. Jordan sat on the other side of the plexiglass partition, orange jumpsuit wrinkled at the collar, hands resting flat on the metal table like he was trying not to clench them. He didn't look up right away, just stared at the scratched surface between them, jaw working. She sat. He finally raised his eyes. They looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that comes from betrayal. Or maybe disappointment that had calcified into something harder. So it's true, he said. You really came. Amelia folded her hands. I told Dad I would. Jordan gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, I figured it was either that or hell froze over. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. You always this welcoming, or is it just for me? He leaned back, expression unreadable. It's weird, that's all. After all this time, you just show up like a lawyer out of a courtroom drama. I didn't come here to play hero, she said quietly. I came because you're facing felony charges and nobody else in this family knows how to deal with that. He looked away. Amelia took a slow breath. We don't have time for the awkward sibling dance, Jordan. I need you to focus. I am focused, he snapped. You're the one acting like this is some noble cause, like suddenly you give a damn. The words hit harder than she let show. He kept going. Do you know what Mom's been calling me since I was in middle school? Hope, her light, her fresh start after you disappointed her. You were the rebel, the trouble, the mess. I was her clean slate. He leaned forward now, voice low, bitter. She used to say, "You'll do it right, Jordan. You won't end up like your sister." Amelia's stomach nodded, but her face remained composed. Jordan stared at her, testing her silence. She called you a mistake, you know, he added. Not to your face, but plenty of times. Said you had too much heart and not enough brains, that you let some musician ruin your life and then dragged a mixed baby into the world out of pride. Amelia blinked just once. But me, Jordan laughed bitterly. I was her masterpiece, until I threw a punch. Now suddenly I'm the cautionary tale. I know what she thinks of me, Amelia said softly. Do you? His eyes locked onto hers. Then why are you here? A beat passed. 2. Then she answered calmly, clearly. Because this case matters. Because you matter even if you don't believe I ever saw that. I didn't come here because of Family Jordan. I came for justice. He scoffed. Justice, don't give me that. You didn't talk to me for years. You didn't talk to me either. I was a kid, you left. I was left, she corrected. Her voice was still low but firmer now. I didn't walk away. I was pushed out. And nobody came after me. Not you, not them. I begged at that door in the rain, Jordan, with your nephew in my stomach. He looked down. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she continued. I'm asking you to let me help you. You can hate me later if you want. But right now you need someone who gives a damn about the truth. Jordan tapped his knuckles on the table. Once, twice. Tell me about the footage, he said finally. Amelia reached into her folder, slid the still image across the barrier, a printout of the exact frame where the knife caught the light. His eyes widened. You found that? I did. A woman at this corner store had a camera. It shows everything. Emery pulling the blade, you stepping back, you reacting. He exhaled slowly like something was unclenching inside him for the first time since the arrest. Will it be enough? It's not exoneration, she said. But it changes the narrative. It shows fear, reaction, not aggression. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't want to hit him, he whispered. I really didn't. I believe you. He looked up at her again. You do? I know what panic looks like, she said. And I know what being misjudged feels like. Jordan gave a shaky breath and nodded. Silence stretched between them longer this time, but not uncomfortable. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Do you ever miss it? What? The family, the dinners, the holidays, before everything broke. Amelia stared at him. Her throat tightened, but she didn't flinch. I miss what I thought we were, she said, but what we were never really existed. Jordan nodded slowly. The officer knocked on the window. Time was up. Amelia gathered her folder. As she stood, Jordan said, For what it's worth, I'm glad it's you. She paused. He added, I don't think anyone else could have faced Mom like you did. She managed a thin smile. Get some rest. We've got work to do. Then she turned and walked out of the room, heels echoing behind her like punctuation marks. Outside, the sky was still gray but no longer raining. Inside, something had shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of something harder. And braver. Like truth. The security footage flickered on her screen again, low-res, silent and angled from across the street, but Amelia had watched it enough times now to memorize every twitch of movement, every shadow. She leaned in close, pausing at the exact moment the man Emery stepped into Jordan's path. She clicked rewind again, frame by frame. Jordan walking with earbuds in, distracted but calm. Emery rising from the bench like he'd been waiting for something. The first gesture, his hand stiff and quick pointing. His mouth moved fast, animated. Jordan backing up, Emery stepping forward. Amelia paused it again. The knife barely a glint, but unmistakable just before the punch. But something else snagged her attention. Before the punch, there were at least 10 seconds of interaction that hadn't made it into the viral clip. She opened both videos side by side, the viral one and the surveillance footage. The difference was glaring. The viral one started after the knife was already tucked away, after the provocation, after the threat. Just in time to catch the punch. She felt her jaw tighten. Somebody had deliberately cropped it. She checked the metadata. The user who posted it online had an anonymous handle, but the video was originally uploaded within an hour of the incident. Way too fast for a bystander to just stumble into. Which meant either someone wanted to humiliate Jordan quickly, or someone wanted to bury the full context. Amelia pushed back from her laptop and rubbed her eyes. All right, she muttered. Who's the missing link? She drove back to the scene third and Myrtle around midday, hoping some of the same faces might be hanging around. Familiar routines, habits. That kind of repetition was the only reliable thing about street corners. She pulled her coat tighter around her waist as she stepped out into the crisp air. Her heels clicked down the sidewalk as she approached the old bus shelter. The man pushing the cart from earlier wasn't there. The corner store was open, same cashier inside, but the bench empty now looked smaller in the daylight. She scanned the storefronts. 4 buildings down a second-story window cracked open above a laundromat. Curtains shifted. She saw him then, a thin, wiry man in his 70s peeking through lace curtains. Watching. He'd been in the background of the footage, standing near the doorway just out of frame. Her brain had noted him. She hadn't pursued it until now. She crossed the street and rang the buzzer beside the battered front door. A tinny voice crackled through the intercom. "Who is it? My name is Amelia Carter. I'm a legal advocate," she said clearly. "I think you saw what happened outside the bus stop. I just need 5 minutes." Silence. She waited. Then the lock clicked. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and boiled potatoes. The stairs creaked as she climbed to the second floor. The door at the top opened before she knocked. He stood barefoot on threadbare carpet, wearing a maroon cardigan 2 sizes too big. His eyes were sharp, though, and wary. "You're his sister," he said. "The boy who punched the vet." "I'm his attorney," she replied. "But yes, I'm his sister." He studied her for a moment. "You look tired." She gave a dry smile. "You have no idea." He stepped aside. The apartment was small. 1 room, a kitchenette, a bed shoved against the wall, and a battered recliner facing an old box TV. A chessboard sat out on a folding table pieces mid-game. A pair of binoculars rested beside a lukewarm cup of coffee. "You saw it all, didn't you?" she asked gently. He nodded once, start to finish. "Why haven't you come forward?" He sat in the recliner, slow and deliberate. "Because people don't like trouble. And what I saw was trouble. From both of them." "Emery had a knife," she said. He nodded again. "I know." "Did you see it?" "I saw him pull something. Flash of metal, before the punch, not after." "Would you be willing to give a statement?" Amelia asked. He didn't answer. Just stared at the chessboard, then picked up a knight and rotated it in his hand. "They came by," he said. "Who?" "2 suits. Not police. Private. Said they were representing a veterans support initiative tied to Emery's old unit. One of them leaned on me pretty hard." Amelia's stomach turned. "They threatened you." "Not directly. Just made it clear I'd be very unwise to insert myself into a matter involving public sentiment. Told me the town already hated what your brother did. Said anyone defending him would be collateral." "And you listened to them?" His eyes met hers, calm but sharp. "No." I waited. "For what?" "For someone to ask the right way." She sat slowly across from him. "What's your name?" "Howard Renly." "Mr. Renly, if I protect you, your identity, your safety, will you give me a sworn affidavit?" He placed the knight back on the board. "You'll do it pro bono?" he asked. "For me?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "You help my brother get justice. I'll help you with any legal paperwork. Tenant rights, access to services, whatever you need. That's my promise." He studied her for a long moment. "You have your mother's fire," he said, "but your father's restraint." Amelia's lips twitched. "Not sure that's a compliment." He chuckled. "Neither am I." Then he stood crossed to a small filing cabinet wedged between his bed and the kitchenette and pulled out a yellow notepad. "I already wrote it down," he said, handing it to her. "Every detail, just in case no one ever came." Amelia took it gently. Why, she asked. "Why did you write it down if you weren't going to testify?" He looked out the window. "Because truth doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it just needs to exist. And I didn't want this one disappearing." She felt the burn behind her eyes, then brief and hot, but swallowed it down. "Thank you," she whispered. As she stepped back into the hallway, file clutched in hand, she knew this wasn't just about clearing Jordan's name. It was about breaking the silence woven into every lie. And this was the first crack in the wall. The door creaked on its hinges as Amelia stepped into the narrow hallway. The yellow notepad from Mr. Renly clutched in her hand like a blade sharpened by truth. Her mind was spinning evidence strategy, how to present the affidavit in court, but none of it prepared her for the figure waiting in the threshold of the front door. Her mother. Deborah Carter stood like a barricade, arms crossed over her chest, lips drawn so tight they'd almost disappeared. She wasn't blocking the door physically, but emotionally, psychologically, she was the wall Amelia had been pushing against her entire life. The silence between them was thick, brittle seconds away from shattering. Amelia didn't flinch. She walked toward the door without breaking stride. But her mother's voice, cold and precise, cut through the air like glass. "If you lose this case," she said, "don't bother coming back here." Amelia stopped the words landing like a slap. She turned slowly. You think this is some kind of ultimatum? She asked, voice calm but coiled. It's a fact, Deborah said. I will not let this family be dragged through the mud any further. You've already humiliated us enough. Humiliated, Amelia repeated, her eyes narrowing. You think this is about embarrassment? About public image? Deborah didn't blink. You want to defend a boy who assaulted a homeless man and in doing so bring shame to this family again? And for what? So you can play attorney in front of an audience? I'm defending my brother, Amelia said. And I'm doing it the right way. The way none of you ever had the courage to do when it counted. Her mother stepped forward, voice low, shaking slightly. You walk into this house like you belong, like the past didn't happen. Like we're supposed to ignore everything you did. You mean everything you did to me? Amelia shot back. The silence. The exile. The day you shut the door in my face while I was pregnant with your grandson. Her mother's jaw clenched, but she didn't answer. I begged you, Amelia continued. I stood in the rain, soaked to the skin, and begged for 1 ounce of compassion. You told me to live with the consequences. You made choices, Deborah said. You defied us. I chose love, Amelia said, and you turned your back on me for it. The tension cracked sharp and deep. Then her mother delivered the blow she'd been holding. If you lose this case, if you fail, we don't want to see you again. Not you, not your son. There it was. The cruelty dressed in quiet authority. Amelia stared at her for a long moment, not blinking, not breathing, and then she laughed, soft, dry, exhausted. Don't worry, she said. You've made it very clear we were never really welcome here. She took a step forward. Her mother didn't move. Let me be clear too, Amelia said. I'm not doing this for your approval. I'm not fighting for your reputation or this house or whatever frozen version of control you're still clinging to. She leaned in, voice razor sharp. I'm fighting for truth, for justice, for my brother. Not because of this family, but in spite of it. Her mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Amelia reached for the door. Good, she added, glancing over her shoulder. Now I know exactly what I'm walking away from. And she opened the door. Malik was sitting on the porch steps, legs swinging a juice box in one hand. He looked up the moment he heard the door open. Mommy, he said, jumping to his feet. Are we going? Yeah, baby, she said. We're going. She held the door open long enough for the cold air to cut through the hallway, for her mother to feel the breeze, to feel the emptiness that came with a daughter leaving for good. But just as she stepped down the first stair, she heard her son's voice again, small, sincere. Mom, Malik said, tugging at her sleeve. Please don't cry again. Okay. She hadn't realized her eyes were wet. She blinked, quickly wiped at her cheeks. Her hands shook. I'm okay, she whispered. You promise? She crouched down, pulling him close, his small arms wrapping around her neck like an anchor. I promise, she said. But let's get out of here just in case. He giggled. She stood up and walked toward the car, the gravel crunching underfoot like glass breaking beneath every step. When she reached the driver's seat and closed the door, she allowed herself one last look at the house through the windshield. The porch. The door. The woman still standing behind the screen, a statue built from pride and fear. And then she turned the key. The engine roared to life. She didn't look back again, because some homes are just walls. And Amelia Carter had finally learned how to build something stronger. The courtroom was colder than she expected. Not just from the air conditioning, which buzzed quietly from a vent above the jury box, but from the way eyes lingered on her as she walked toward the defense table. Eyes that didn't just see a lawyer, they saw something else. Something they hadn't decided how to categorize yet. Family outsider, or simply inconvenient. Amelia Carter adjusted her blazer, ran a hand across her legal pad, and looked at the young man sitting beside her. Jordan stared forward, stiff in his dress shirt and blazer, lips pressed into a line. The orange jumpsuit was gone for now, replaced with borrowed dignity, but the pressure weighed on him. Across the aisle, the prosecution team wore crisp suits and smug assurance. The lead attorney, Robert Colton, middle-aged white with a voice like polished wood, rose as Judge Whitaker entered. All rise! The room stood. The bailiff's voice echoed. Then the judge took her seat, and the hum of tension settled in. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Whitaker began. We are here today to determine whether the defendant, Mr. Jordan Carter, acted in self-defense or in reckless aggression on the night in question. Amelia glanced at the jury box. 12 strangers, mostly white, mostly older, their faces tight, arms crossed. One woman near the back had her jaw clenched as if she'd already decided. Colton wasted no time. He rose with calm theatricality and stepped toward the screen set up near the jury. I present to you Exhibit A, he said. Footage of the defendant physically assaulting an unhoused veteran in what appears to be an unprovoked attack. Click. The video played. Short, sharp, cut to incite. Jordan walking. Emery rising. A punch. The man falling. No audio, no context, no blade, just brutality in 30 seconds. Gasps in the gallery. One juror flinched. Colton turned voice grave. This is what the state believes was a moment of uncontrolled rage. Not fear, not defense, just rage. He let it sink in. Amelia stood slowly, every cell in her body resisting the urge to shout lies. Objection, she said. The footage is incomplete. Colton turned. The defense may speak during cross-examination, Your Honor. Amelia stepped closer to the judge. I have evidence that this video was doctored, cropped to remove key context. We have alternate footage that clearly shows the victim drawing a weapon. Alleged weapon, Colton interrupted. Judge Whitaker held up a hand. Both sides will present their arguments fully. Ms. Carter, do you have authentication for this alternate footage? I do. Security cam from a nearby store. Full chain of custody. Whitaker nodded. Then you'll present it during your time. Amelia sat jaw-locked. She felt Jordan shift beside her. You okay? He whispered. No, she whispered back. But I'm focused. The prosecution continued painting a picture of Jordan as emotionally unstable, driven by anger, possibly under the influence. Colton dropped phrases like prior temper incidents and pattern of behavior, carefully avoiding full accusation, but planting seeds in the jury's mind. When Amelia's turn came, she rose with the poise of someone not just defending her client, but defending the very space she was allowed to occupy in the room. I'm Amelia Carter, she began. Licensed attorney, graduate of Columbia Law. She paused, letting her voice settle. And sister of the defendant. A murmur rolled through the room. Colton stood. Your Honor, I must note the clear conflict of interest. Ms. Carter cannot possibly be objective. Amelia didn't flinch. She turned toward the jury. They've already made clear they don't see me as part of this family. I was erased the day I brought home a child that didn't match their version of perfection. She turned back to the judge. So if objectivity is your concern, rest assured I've never been treated like a sister, so I have no sentiment to bias me. Silence. Judge Whitaker stared at her for a long second. Overruled, she said. Amelia clicked her remote. A new video queued up on the screen. Black and white. Security footage. Time-stamped. Jordan walking. Emery standing. A flash of metal. A step forward. Jordan backing up. Then only then the punch. Gasps again, but different this time. Softer. Sharper. Colton stood abruptly. Objection, this footage may be fabricated. It's verified, Amelia snapped. Chain of custody documented. And it shows the truth your video cut out. The jury watched in stunned silence. Amelia stepped forward. What matters here is not just what you saw, but what you weren't allowed to see. Context changes everything. Intent matters. Truth matters. She paused, eyes sweeping the faces of the jury. You're not just deciding whether my client threw a punch. You're deciding whether justice can still exist in a courtroom that almost let half a truth become the whole story. A beat passed. The judge leaned in. We'll recess for 15 minutes. Gavel struck. As the courtroom buzzed and emptied, Amelia sat down beside Jordan again, adrenaline still thudding through her veins. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he muttered, that was intense. She gave a short breath of laughter. Welcome to trial law. He looked at her. I mean, thank you. She shook her head. We're not done yet. But we just gave them a reason to think twice. And for the first time since the trial began, she saw it. One juror, leaning forward. Eyes no longer skeptical, but listening. Under the relentless white of courtroom fluorescence, Amelia thought nothing could sting more than being accused of bias for simply defending her own brother. But that sting had a twin, and it arrived the next morning. Her phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m., lit with a dozen missed calls and an unending scroll of notifications. Texts, voicemails, mentions. One headline kept surfacing, copy-pasted across feeds and retweets. Mother of defense attorney in assault case authored anti-interracial blog post. She stared at the words in bed, heart clenched, fingers trembling slightly as she tapped the link. It was a cached copy of a blog post from nearly a decade ago, an old forgotten blog titled Protecting Our Values. Author Deborah M. Carter. The post, written in clinical passive-aggressive language, had one venomous core. While I believe in tolerance, I do not condone interracial unions, especially those involving the blending of opposing cultural values. Such choices disrupt lineage identity and community cohesion. Below, a comment from the same IP address reaffirmed I told my daughter, and I'll tell any parent, don't dilute your heritage for love. There was no room for interpretation. It wasn't ignorance, it was conviction. By 9:00 a.m., the blog had been shared by several social justice accounts. Activists reposted screenshots. A video surfaced of a student-led protest outside Deborah's place of worship. Placards read, "Hate at home, you can't preach love and post hate, and Amelia, we see you." By noon, reporters were camped outside the Carter residence. One photo showed Deborah shielding her face behind a newspaper while trying to exit her car. Another captured a neighbor hanging a handmade sign, "No racism here." The Carter family wasn't just under scrutiny, they were being excommunicated by the very community they once claimed to represent. And Deborah predictably called Amelia. The voicemail was venomous. "You think you're clever. You think this stunt will help your case. You've humiliated us, Amelia. You dragged skeletons out of a private place just to earn sympathy in court. Don't think for a second this clears your name, it stains it with betrayal." Amelia saved the voicemail without replying. But later that night, she showed up at the Carter house not for redemption, for confrontation. She stood in the foyer again, that hollow corridor that had once closed its arms on her. Deborah stood by the fireplace, her face pale, not with shame, but with fury barely contained. "You set the world on us," Deborah said, voice low and shaking, like a pack of dogs. "I did nothing but speak the truth," Amelia replied. "They found your words, not mine." "You could have stopped it," her mother hissed. "You know what this means for your father's campaign, for our church, for our friends." "I know exactly what it means," Amelia said. "It means people finally see what I've seen my entire life." "Oh, get off your soapbox. You think this makes you righteous?" Amelia stepped forward, calm, cutting. "You looked at my son the day he was born and called him a reminder of shame. And now the world has seen that shame, but it isn't Malik. It's you." Her mother flinched. Not visibly, not outwardly, but somewhere behind the eyes, the mask cracked. "You could have buried it," Deborah whispered. "I did bury it," Amelia said, voice sharp. "For 3 years. I swallowed the shame you handed me and turned it into degrees, into courtrooms, into a life I built without you. And you know what? The only reason it's all coming up now is because you forced me to walk back in here." Her mother gripped the mantle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Amelia stepped even closer. "This is not fallout from me," she said. "It's consequence. The world isn't punishing you for loving the wrong person. It's punishing you for hating the right ones." Deborah looked up, lips parted, but no words came out. "Don't blame me for the fire," Amelia said quietly. "You lit it. I just refused to burn quietly in it." She turned to leave, but at the door she paused. "By the way," she added, "Malik saw the signs outside the house on TV. He asked me what they meant." Her mother stiffened. "I told him Amelia said they mean people don't tolerate hate anymore, and neither will his mother." Then she walked out, letting the door close behind her with the finality of a gavel. Outside, the cold air bit her cheeks. Protesters were gone. The cameras for now had moved on. But Amelia knew this wasn't over. The trial wasn't just about Jordan anymore. It was about what kind of truth the world was finally ready to face. And who had the courage to say it first? Under the solemn hush of the courtroom, Amelia Carter stood at the center, like a blade drawn from its sheath. Every word, every fact, every truth she had bled to gather was finally about to speak for itself. But the silence of the room wasn't anticipation. It was tension stretched taut across disbelief after days of slanted videos and character assassinations. "Your Honor," Amelia said steadily, "the defense calls Mr. Morris Whitlow to the stand." There was a brief rustle at the back as an elderly black man in a worn corduroy blazer rose leaning on a wooden cane, escorted gently by the bailiff. He moved slowly, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much to be shaken by a courtroom. As he was sworn in, Amelia nodded once in gratitude. Morris didn't meet her eyes, but she knew what it had cost him to show up. She began softly. "Mr. Whitlow, were you present at the corner of Myrtle and Ash on the night of March 4th? "I was," he said, voice calm and gravelly. "I live right there, apartment 3B. My window looks over the street." "Did you witness the incident between my client Jordan Carter and the victim Emery Leeds?" "Yes, I did." She stepped closer, aware of the prosecution's squirm behind her. "Please describe what you saw." Morris took a breath. His hands folded carefully on the rail before him. "Emery was sitting on that bench when Jordan walked past. I saw Emery stand up kinda quick. Then he said something I couldn't hear. But next thing I knew, he pulled something shiny out his jacket." "Do you believe it was a knife?" "Yes." Blade caught the light just enough. The courtroom murmured. Amelia raised a hand for silence. "And what did Jordan do?" He froze, took a step back, told Emery to put it away. Emery lunged, and that's when Jordan hit him. Amelia turned toward the jury. "Did it appear to you that Jordan was the aggressor?" "No," Morris said firmly. "He looked scared, like he was trying to get away." She nodded, walked to the table, and picked up a remote. "Permission to play the full footage from Exhibit C." The judge gestured. "Proceed." The screen lit up. Same camera angle the prosecution had used. But now the full truth. Jordan walking. Emery rising too fast, too suddenly. A brief exchange, then a flash of silver in Emery's hand. He stepped forward. Jordan backed up. Then and only then impact. And Emery hit the pavement. Silence. Not a breath in the room. Amelia looked toward the jury. Some were leaning in. One had tears in her eyes. She turned back to Morris. "Were you ever contacted to share this account before today?" "I tried," Morris said. "But after I mentioned a weapon, some officer told me maybe I should let sleeping dogs lie. Next thing I know, I stopped getting callbacks." Amelia paused, let that hang. "Nothing further," she said. As she stepped back, the prosecutor hesitated, rising slowly, like a man stepping into his own collapse. "Mr. Whitlow," he began. "How clear was your view?" "It was night. Wasn't it possible you misinterpreted what you saw?" Morris smiled faintly. "Son, I was in the Navy 16 years. I've seen enough blades at night to know what one looks like. And I still got both eyes." A few jurors chuckled quietly. The prosecutor sat down, defeated. Amelia stood once more holding the remote. "There's one more thing," she said, "if the court would permit." She pressed a button. A split screen appeared. Left the edited viral video. Right the full version. The difference was damning. One framed a criminal. The other exposed a victim surviving. The judge cleared her throat. "Let the record show the defense has submitted video evidence demonstrating context previously omitted by the prosecution's exhibit." Amelia didn't gloat. She simply said, "That's all, Your Honor," and sat. Jordan leaned toward her. His voice shook. "You just changed everything." Amelia didn't smile. Her hands still trembled slightly. Her pulse still surged like she was running through a burning house. "No," she said. "The truth did." And for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom felt just a little bit closer to justice. The courtroom was suffocating in its silence. After Morris Whitlow's testimony and the revelation of the uncut footage, the air in the room had changed. The kind of shift no gavel could silence, no suit could hide. Even the prosecutor, once confident, once smug, now fidgeted behind his briefcase like it might shield him from the consequences of what had just unraveled. But he tried. Of course he tried. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice tighter than before, "while we now have additional footage and an eyewitness account, I urge you to remember. Perception is not fact. Fear is not always justified. And self-defense. Self-defense requires more than reaction. It requires necessity." He walked toward the jury box with a measured step, but there was a tremor underneath it. "You saw the hit. You saw the man fall. That much is undeniable. We don't convict people based on potential threats or how they feel in the moment. We convict on action." He paused for effect. This wasn't a case of life or death. This was a case of poor judgment. A young man overreacting. He looked toward Jordan, and perhaps a family attempting to cover it up. Gasps fluttered from the gallery. Amelia stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. That is both speculative and slanderous." "Sustained," the judge snapped. But the prosecutor had done what he came to do, throw one last shadow. Amelia remained standing as the judge invited closing arguments. Her palms were open, steady. She didn't move toward the jury box right away. She just stood. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she said, voice calm. "That's what they said when I first applied to law school. That I wouldn't get in. That I wouldn't last. That no one would take a woman like me seriously. And by like me, they meant black. They meant poor. They meant young. And later they meant mother." She paced slowly now, eyes sweeping across the jurors. "But I did make it here. And I am standing before you now not as someone desperate to save her brother, but as a representative of truth." She clicked the remote once again. The split screen reappeared. The lie and the truth, side by side. "I want you to remember what justice looked like, when it had no context, and then what it became when you saw the whole picture." She turned. "Jordan Carter is not on trial because he committed a violent crime. He's on trial because someone tried to make him look like he did. Because people are used to assuming guilt when they see a young black man raise his fist no matter what came before it." She stepped closer to the jury box. "I'm not asking you to see Jordan as my brother. You don't have to feel sympathy. I'm asking you to see him as a citizen, protected by the same laws that protect you, the same rights, the same truths." Amelia took a breath. "And remember, the prosecution said that fear isn't always justified." She raised her voice. "But what about when fear is real? What about when it's backed by a weapon in someone's hand and the blood memory of a country that still doesn't protect men like him the same way it protects others?" She looked at each juror one by one. "You saw that blade. You saw the step forward. You saw a young man react not in rage but in survival." Amelia paused now. Let the weight of everything rest on what came next. Justice doesn't wear a uniform. It doesn't speak one language. It doesn't come from one neighborhood. It does not and has never belonged to one race. She drew in one last breath. Justice doesn't have a skin color, she said, her voice ringing across the walls. It only has the truth. And then she sat. The judge turned to the jury. You will now deliberate, she said. You must weigh only the facts. Not family ties, not reputations, only the evidence. The 12 rose somber and silent and were led out of the room. As the heavy door closed behind them, the room finally exhaled. Jordan leaned over to his sister. No matter what they decide, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Amelia didn't smile. Instead, she stared forward at the closed jury door. Because now the waiting would begin. And the truth now exposed still needed someone brave enough to believe it. The courtroom doors swung open and the jury stepped back in. Their expressions were unreadable, but Amelia had spent enough time studying human faces to recognize tension when it entered a room. The foreperson, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, held a folded paper in her hand like it was a live wire. The judge adjusted her glasses. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. We have your honor. She passed the slip to the bailiff who delivered it to the bench. The judge scanned the verdict silently. Then her gaze rose slowly to the room. In the case of the state versus Jordan Carter on the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant. Amelia's pulse thundered behind her ribs. Not guilty. A collective inhale swept through the courtroom, and then release. Chairs scraped. Hands clutched hearts. Jordan's shoulders collapsed into trembling relief as his head dropped forward. Amelia didn't move. For a heartbeat, she simply watched her brother try to catch his breath after weeks of holding it. Then she stood. And for the first time since the trial began, she smiled. Malik, sitting in the second row, shot up on his feet and clapped once before realizing he was the only child in the room. But it was enough. The wave of emotion rippled forward and a few others joined in. A small, shaky applause. Jordan turned to her, blinking fast. I thought I was done, he whispered. You almost were, she said, touching his shoulder. But the truth knew how to swim. On the other side of the aisle, Deborah Carter sat frozen in her seat. Her eyes shimmered, but not with joy. Her hands clutched her purse so tightly the leather bent. She looked not like a mother grateful for her child's freedom, but like a woman watching her own reflection crack before a crowd. Tears slid down her cheeks. But not for justice. Not for her son. They fell for shame. For the unraveling of the carefully preserved image she'd worn for decades. The blog post. The trial. The protest signs. The judgment. The mirror held up by a daughter who refused to stay quiet. Her husband, Martin Carter, touched her shoulder, a ghost of comfort. But she didn't lean in. Martin cleared his throat and looked at Amelia as she gathered her files into her bag. Amelia, he said, stepping into her path. She looked up. Your mother made some mistakes. We both did, he said. But you did something incredible. She didn't respond. Why don't you both stay for dinner? He offered. Malik, too. Your old room's still got your things. We can talk. As a family. Amelia tilted her head. A family, she repeated. He nodded. It's never too late, right? But there was something hollow in his voice, like the words had been polished before being offered safe, rehearsed, fragile. Amelia glanced towards her mother, still seated, still weeping, yet still not looking at her. Still not speaking to her grandson. Still not saying his name. No, Amelia said quietly. Sometimes it is too late. Martin blinked. You don't mean that. I do, she replied. She knelt down beside Malik, zipped his backpack, and helped him into his coat. You see, she said, rising, I spent 3 years trying to build a home where truth didn't have to be hidden, where my son's skin wouldn't be seen as a stain, where I wouldn't have to shrink myself to fit someone else's idea of pride. She turned to her father, and I did it. I built that home, without your table, without your name. He stepped back. Amelia took Malik's hand. Come on, baby, she said softly. Where are we going, Mom? He asked. She looked down at him and smiled. Home, the real kind. And as she walked past her parents, past the pew where her mother still sat in silent wreckage, Malik looked back for a moment. Just a glance. Then he faced forward. Together they stepped into the cold light of freedom. The lobby was still buzzing. Reporters whispered. Cameras flashed. But Amelia didn't pause. Outside, the wind had picked up. Crisp and dry, like something being wiped clean. Malik tugged her coat sleeve. Are you okay, Mom? She stopped, knelt beside him. I am now, she said. He studied her face. Does this mean we don't have to see Grandma anymore? Amelia smiled. It means we get to decide who's in our lives, and who isn't. They stood on the courthouse steps as the crowd behind them began to spill out. Jordan emerged, greeted by friends and strangers with relief in their eyes. But Amelia didn't wait. She didn't need applause. She didn't need forgiveness. She had her son's hand. She had her own voice. And she had her truth finally heard. Behind them, the courthouse doors creaked shut. and with them the final echo of a name she no longer needed to carry. 3 weeks after the verdict, Amelia Carter sat at her kitchen table, the same chipped wood surface she once used as a study desk, a diaper-changing station, and a makeshift courtroom with Malik's action figures as jurors. Now it was something else, a desk for writing. Her laptop glowed against the early evening shadows as she leaned over the keyboard, fingers poised, eyes steady. She titled the piece "The Price of Being Right in the Wrong Family," and then she began. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't revenge. It was a confession, a tapestry of pain, survival, hope, and clarity stitched through 3 years of silence. She wrote about the night her mother closed the door, about walking through rain with a belly full of life and nowhere to sleep. She wrote about feeding Malik peanut butter crackers for dinner while memorizing legal codes at midnight. She wrote about shame, how it clung to her like a second skin, not because of her choices, but because the people who were supposed to love her made her question them. And she wrote about choosing healing over hatred, how the court victory wasn't a triumph but a release. The article went live on a quiet Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it had gone viral. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Comments poured in. Women who had been disowned, mothers raising biracial children alone, people from all walks of life who had been rejected for who they loved, who they were, who they chose to become. Amelia's inbox overflowed with stories that mirrored her own, and with one repeated phrase, "You made me feel seen." She was invited to speak on podcasts, to join panels, but she declined most of them. Because Amelia didn't want to become a face. She wanted to build a space. And so, with the settlement money, Jordan insisted on splitting. "You saved my life, sis. Let me invest in yours." She rented a narrow brick storefront 2 blocks from her apartment. It had water damage, faded linoleum, and a neon sign that buzzed even when unplugged. But to Amelia, it was perfect. She painted the walls herself, white with gold trim. Malik helped mostly by getting paint on his shoes and tracking it across the floor. She named it Second Light Legal. Her mission was clear: to provide free and low-cost legal advocacy for single mothers, women of color, and anyone who'd ever been told they weren't worth fighting for. Her first client was a teenage girl being forced out of her parents' home after coming out. Her second, a Filipino immigrant fired for reporting racial slurs. Her third, a grandmother denied custody of her grandson because of her age. Amelia didn't win every case, but she showed up for every single one. And people noticed. Clients started leaving flowers on her doorstep. A former inmate brought her a fresh loaf of bread every Thursday. A journalist from The Atlantic stopped by just to shake her hand. Meanwhile, Malik was thriving. He was 7 now, sharp-witted and gentle-hearted. He made jokes that landed like lightning and asked questions Amelia still couldn't answer without choking up. "Mom, do you think people can be unlearned? You mean like, if someone taught them to hate, yeah, can they forget that lesson?" She looked at him long and hard. "I don't know if they forget," she said, "but they can decide not to listen to that voice anymore." He seemed satisfied with that for now. One Thursday afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the waiting room floor and the old neon sign buzzed stubbornly above her office, there was a knock at the glass door. She looked up and paused. Jordan stood outside, hands tucked in his coat pockets, eyes cautious. She opened the door. "You're early," she teased, though he hadn't said he was coming. "I brought something," he said. "It wasn't a gift. It wasn't flowers or a card. It was an apology." "I should have stood up for you back then," he said, stepping inside. "When Mom called you selfish, when Dad wouldn't say your kid's name, I didn't want to get thrown out too." Amelia nodded. "I know. I thought staying quiet was safe, but it wasn't. It was just cowardly." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "You want coffee?" He laughed. "I forgot how bad your coffee is." "I upgraded," she smirked. Malik insisted on the fancy machine. They sat for a long while, no longer siblings divided by pain, but survivors of the same fire, finally talking about the burn. Jordan looked around the small office. "You really did this." "I had to," she said. "There were too many people like me who didn't have anyone to stand for them." He nodded. "Do you think they'll ever change, Mom, Dad?" Amelia didn't answer right away. She looked toward the back room where Malik was drawing planets on a whiteboard. "I don't know," she said, but I stopped waiting. Jordan leaned forward. "You could have let me rot, and no one would have blamed you." "I didn't do it for you," she replied. "I did it for justice." He smiled. Same Amelia. Cold, calculated. She looked at him sharply. Not cold, boundaried. There's a difference. They laughed together, the sound unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Before he left, he turned at the door. "You really built a home here, huh?" She nodded. "One where nobody's love is conditional." The door clicked shut behind him. Amelia returned to her desk, fingers poised once more. She opened a fresh document. At the top, she typed, "Healing is not soft, it's brave. It's not a detour from justice, it's the road back to ourselves." Then she pressed save, not as a writer, but as a woman who chose freedom over fury, and found everything she needed on the other side. The phone rang at 9:17 p.m. on a Friday. Amelia had just finished reading Malik his bedtime story, some silly fantasy about a dragon allergic to fire, and was halfway through washing dishes when the ringtone echoed through the small apartment. It was a sound she no longer flinched at, but tonight it stopped her hands cold. The screen glowed softly on the counter. Deborah Carter. The name sat on the display like an unopened letter from a war-long past. For a long moment, Amelia just stood there. The bubbles slid down her wrists. Malik's laughter still echoed faintly from his room. And still the phone rang. She answered on the fifth ring. "Hello!" There was a pause. A breath. That familiar tension that only existed between two people bound by blood, severed by silence. Then the voice fragile, as if it had to push through pride just to form words. "Amelia." She didn't respond. Not right away. She let her mother sit in the quiet she had built for herself. Let her realize that she no longer had access to the space without knocking. "I didn't know if you'd even pick up," Deborah said. Her voice cracked faintly. "But I've been thinking about things. About everything." Amelia folded the dish rag slowly. "I doubt that." "No," Deborah replied quickly. "I mean it. The trial, the article, what people are saying, what you lived through, what we did to you." Another silence, then, "I was wrong, Amelia." Amelia stared at the faucet, still dripping gently. "I was so afraid," Deborah continued. "Afraid of change, of judgment, of losing control. I told myself it was about values, about protecting family, but I wasn't protecting anything. I was hiding behind fear." There was an ache in her voice that hadn't been there before, not the performative sadness she wore at the trial. This was different, slower, heavier. "I see now what I couldn't see," then she said, "and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for turning you away, and for turning my back on Malik." At that, Amelia's jaw clenched. "You didn't just turn your back," she said quietly. "You never even said his name. You treated him like a consequence, not a child." "I know." Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "That's why I'm calling. I wanted to ask if I could see him. If I could see you both." The request hung in the air like smoke. Amelia sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Her hands were steady, but her heartbeat wasn't. So many nights she had dreamt of hearing those words. Imagined her mother realizing the damage, picking up the phone, begging to make it right. But reality was not a script. There was no tidy resolution. She took a long breath. "Meeting us," she said finally, "doesn't mean forgiveness." "I know," Deborah replied. "I'm not asking for that." "Then what are you asking for?" There was a rustle on the line, as if her mother had turned away from something, maybe the sound of her own guilt. "Just a beginning. I want to try. I want to learn how to be better. I don't expect to be called grandma or hugged or welcomed. I just want to earn the right to be in the same room again." Amelia looked up. Malik stood in the hallway, peeking around the corner. He didn't say a word, but his eyes met hers with quiet curiosity. She covered the mouthpiece. "It's Grandma," she whispered. He raised an eyebrow. "For real?" She nodded. "What does she want?" he asked. Amelia thought for a moment. "A second chance? Maybe a first one, really." He tilted his head. "Are we giving it?" Amelia's throat tightened. She returned to the phone. "I won't promise anything, Mom," she said firmly. "This isn't some storybook where everyone hugs at the end. I don't trust easily anymore. Especially not when the wound was carved by the people meant to protect me." "I understand," Deborah said. "I do." But Amelia continued. "I believe people can change if they want it badly enough, and I believe in giving people the space to prove who they are now, not just who they were." She swallowed. "So you can see us," she said, "on one condition. Anything. You come here. To my office. Not the house, not your place, my space. You come as a guest, not a mother reclaiming her child, not a grandmother demanding access, just someone who wants to learn how to love again." There was a long pause. Then, "Okay," Deborah said. "I'll be there. Just tell me when." Amelia gave her the time, the address, then hung up without ceremony. She looked at Malik still standing in the hallway in his pajamas. "You sure?" he asked. Amelia knelt down in front of him. "I'm not sure of anything," she said. "But I do know this letting someone in doesn't mean you forget what they did. It just means you're strong enough not to let it define you." He thought about that, then smiled faintly. "You're a good mom." She hugged him tight. "I'm trying." They stood there for a moment, 2 generations of resilience stitched together by grace. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time, it didn't rattle the windows. This time, it sounded almost like permission. The candlelight flickered over Malik's cheeks as he drew in a breath round and determined like the puffed chest of a tiny lion. The room had quieted, everyone paused, smiles lingering midair, waiting for the moment a child claims a wish. Amelia stood behind him, one hand resting gently on his shoulder. He looked up at her eyes shimmering with the innocence of 4 years and the strength of everything he'd unknowingly overcome. "Go ahead, baby," she whispered. Malik closed his eyes, whispered something only the universe could hear, and blew out the candles. Cheers erupted. Confetti poppers cracked in the corners. Someone clapped too loudly. Another kid threw frosting. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the room. It wasn't large, just the multi-purpose space in the back of Amelia's new legal clinic, but it was full. Full of people who mattered. Full of stories that didn't get silenced. Full of colors and accents and hands that had once been shaking but were now steady. There was a mural on the wall, painted by a local artist who'd once been homeless and now taught art therapy. It said in bold, joyful brushstrokes, "We are family, blood not required." Beneath it, a photo string of moments from the clinic's first year, a young mother hugging her daughter outside a courthouse, an elderly man wiping tears as he received citizenship papers, a boy in braces holding up a drawing of Ms. Amelia, the superhero lawyer. Amelia caught sight of her mother in the back corner. Deborah sat quietly with a plate of cake untouched. She hadn't said much since arriving, just "thank you for inviting me" and a sincere effort to make eye contact with Malik. It hadn't been easy, not for either of them. But Deborah showed up every week to Amelia's Listening Sundays, a community event where families came to unlearn bias and relearn empathy. She didn't speak much at first, just sat in the back, took notes. But one Sunday she stood up and apologized, not to Amelia, but to a young couple she once would have crossed the street to avoid. Amelia watched her now, older, smaller somehow, but still trying. "You think Grandma liked the cake?" Malik asked, tugging Amelia's hand. "I think she liked trying to like it." Amelia smiled. "And that's something." He grinned, mouth ringed in blue icing. "You always say trying matters more than pretending." Amelia tousled his curls. "I do say that, don't I?" Jordan arrived late as usual, but this time carrying balloons and a new book for Malik, one about a black astronaut and his daughter. He hugged Amelia, whispered, "Sis, I read your article again. Damn, you wrote us back into humanity." Amelia didn't reply. She didn't need to. The hug was enough. The fact that he came back even when he didn't have to was enough. Later that night, when the streamers had fallen and the guests filtered out, Amelia tucked Malik into bed at home. He asked her, "Mom, do we have a big family?" She sat on the edge of his bed, thoughtful. "We have a wide family," she said. "Not big in number, maybe, but wide enough to hold all the love we make room for." "Like Ms. Greta?" he asked, the elderly trans woman who always brought him paper airplanes and called him Pilot. "Yes," Amelia smiled. "And Uncle Jordan and Grandma now." "Yes, and Mr. Dentist from the clinic, and Nari and Maria and Theo, and even people not born with us. Especially those," she said. "Because family isn't who you're told to love. It's who loves you without condition." Malik turned onto his side processing. "Then I think our family's really, really wide." She kissed his forehead, the widest. She walked to the window and looked out. The street below glowed with soft amber. The legal clinic across the road had its lights off now, but the mural caught just enough streetlight to shimmer. Amelia leaned her head against the frame and let out a breath that had been sitting in her for years. A voiceover began, her voice calm and unshaken. "I built a home with no blueprint, no welcome mat, and no family name etched into the wood. I built it from pain and policy, from rejection and resolve. I built it with the hands that once trembled in fear, but now hold space for others. This house doesn't require sameness. It requires courage. It doesn't deny history. It rewrites it. And here no one is excluded for being different." She turned back from the window, switched off the lamp, and walked down the hall. "Fade to black." A final line appeared in white serif font, slow, deliberate, like a truth that needed no explanation. Justice doesn't whisper. It speaks, even in the silence of rejection. Then only stillness. And in that stillness, underneath the silence, the sound of a small child's laugh lingered, echoing not from pain, but from a place called home.